Hello, everyone. I'm Naomi Polonsky, Associate Curator at the Women's Art Collection, and I'm so pleased to be telling you about the collection today. Thank you all so much for joining. It's amazing to see so many of you, and to Art UK as well for inviting us to be part of this wonderful series of talks. First of all, I will tell you about the remarkable and radical history of the collection, and then I'll speak about a few of the many brilliant works in it by the artists Mary Kelly, Sulter, Rose Garrard, Marlene Rolfe, Paula Rego, and Anya Paintsil. So first of all, to give you some background, the Women's Art Collection is the largest collection of art by women in Europe with over 600 works. It's based at Murray Edwards College, which is one of the two colleges for women at Cambridge University. Works of art are hung all across the college, from the large public spaces like the dining hall to the more private ones like student corridors and staff offices. For example, you can see in this image that there are works on display along these two walkways. And there are also sculptures permanently sited in the college's gardens. Around 95% of the works are on display at any one time. Members of the college effectively live, study, and socialize within a museum collection, but the college is also open to the public every day between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. and free to visit. You can pick up a self-guided tour and see the artworks in all the public spaces of the college. To give you some insight into how this collection came about, I'll give you a short potted history of Murray Edwards College. The college was founded in the mid-50s at a time when there was only one female student at Cambridge for every 11 male students. The university had only started granting degrees to women a few years before. It was the last university in the UK to do so. Frustrated with the lack of opportunities for young women wanting a first-rate education, a group of 44 pioneering women associated with the university began to campaign for more places for women at Cambridge. They faced huge resistance, but were eventually successful in setting up the college, which admitted its first students in 1994. Around 10 years later, the college moved to its current home, a purpose-built structure designed by the newly formed architecture firm Chamberlain, Powell & Bon, who later went on to create the Barbican Centre in London. The architects worked very closely in collaboration with the founding president of the college, Rosemary Murray, to create this landmark brutalist building that has been described as a built manifesto for women's education. The building is inspired by Italian Baroque architecture in its sequence of stunning vistas and its use of light. The spectacular dome, which you can see in this picture, resembles the Renaissance church and was intended to be the visual climax of the visitor's experience. The library recalls the palace chapel at Versailles, but in place of the altar, there is a steep central staircase, which is actually quite terrifying to go up because it's very narrow and steep stairs. But it was supposed to create the sense that women could ascend both literally and metaphorically through learning and knowledge. It's an extraordinary setting for an art collection because of the uniform walls and the sight lines across the building. At this time in the mid-60s, the college had a few eclectic pieces of art on display, all of which were by men. And this was the case until the mid-80s, when the pioneering American artist Mary Kelly undertook a residency at the college in collaboration with Kettle's Yard Gallery, which is just down the road. And the college acquired her work Extase, which I will speak more about later. Motivated by the acquisition of this work, the president of the college at the time, Dr. Valerie Pearl, and a group of academics and staff at the college decided to start an artist appeal where they would ask women artists to donate artworks which could adorn the college walls and provide inspiration for students, researchers, and visitors. Together with Anne Jones, a young curator who was married to an academic at the college, they compiled a list of 20 artists and wrote to them asking whether they would be willing to donate. Out of these, 19 said yes, and they were emboldened by this and continued to send out letters. The collection grew very naturally and organically. Artists recommended one another. Academics at the college suggested artists, and some artists approached the college directly. Many of the artists who donated work came to lunch at the college and selected spots for them to hang. By 1992, the college had received over 70 donated artworks, an extraordinary act of collective giving that indicated women artists' desire to be represented at a time when they were largely overlooked by museums and galleries. Even now, the National Gallery has only 25 works by women out of their collection of 2,391, in other words, 1%. And across the UK, works by women make up only 7% of museum collections. The Women's Art Collection offers a compelling counter-narrative to traditional models of collecting and curating. It wasn't amassed through the wealth of one sole individual, but through the collective efforts of a large group of women and men working together. At the opening party in September 1992, which was so well attended that it was described as a scrum, the feminist art historian Griselda Pollock gave an opening address. And in it, she said, "The artists have agreed to come together and through their vibrant and powerful works, form a permanent testimony to the very idea of a community of women. The artists and their works speak as much to each other as to us, the onlookers. Hanging here together, they provide not a dumb spectacle, but a model of conversation." And I love that phrase, a model of conversation. Since 1992, the collection has continued to expand and to be a source of inspiration with its examples of women's agency and creativity. Most of the works were created from the 1950s onwards to reflect the period when the collection was founded. For most of its history, the collection was open to all works of art created by women. A few years ago, in 2018, the collection gained museum accreditation, and as a requirement of this, articulated a more focused acquisition policy, concentrating on works that think critically about gender, inequality more broadly, and the history of art by women. The works I've selected for the talk today, I think, particularly resonate with this focus, and they're also personal favourites of mine. I will attempt to give you a sort of virtual tour of the collection around the building, but as I said before, the collection is open every day and free to visit, so I would strongly encourage you to come and see it for yourselves. We also stage 2 temporary exhibitions each year, which are accompanied by a public programme of events such as tours, talks, workshops, and screenings. And so now on to the works. Here is Extase, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the acquisition that started the Women's Art Collection. It's currently on display in the college's dining room, also known as the Dome. And here is another image where you can see the works a bit better. Kelly is an American artist who is best known for her iconic work on the mother-child relationship, Postpartum Document, which provoked tabloid outrage when it was shown at London's Institute of Contemporary Art in 1976. A scandalized headline in the Evening Standard ran, "On show at the ICA, ... dirty nappies." It's now considered one of the most important feminist artworks of the 20th century. Mary Kelly often creates project-based works produced over the course of several years and shown as large-scale installations. Her work addresses sexuality, identity, and the impact of historical events on everyday life. Born in America, she moved to London in 1968 at the peak of the student protests taking place across Europe, and became very closely involved in the early women's movement. While her famous Postpartum Document explored the nature of motherhood, her next major series, Interim, delved into the stark unknown terrain of female middle age. Each of the 4 parts in Interim interrogates women's relationship with a different aspect of life: the body, money, history, and power, and is named after the Latin translations for these words. One of the parts, Corpus, examines the way in which middle-aged women experience their bodies in relation to the language of popular medicine, fashion, and romantic fiction. On your screen, you can see the entirety of Corpus on display in a gallery in Los Angeles last year. Corpus itself is composed of 5 parts, each named after one of the so-called passionate attitudes, which the 19th century psychiatrist Jean-Martin Charcot, a one-time teacher of Freud, used to describe hysterical women. These attitudes are menacé, appel, supplication, érotisme, and extase. So just to recap, the entire series is titled Interim. In Interim, one of the 4 parts is Corpus, which you're currently looking at. And in Corpus, one of the 5 parts is Extase, which is part of the women's art collection. And Extase itself is made up of 6 panels. As you can see, the panels alternate rhythmically between light and dark, image and text. The odd-numbered panels contain screen-printed images of the artist's clothes in varying states of disarray. So here you can see her embroidered nightie. These images of the clothes reference photographs taken by Charcot of the patient at his hospital for nervous diseases, La Salpêtrière. The even-numbered panels feature first-person narratives in which anonymous middle-aged women discuss fashion and their experiences as wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. In the 3 years leading up to the project, Mary Kelly kept a notebook, or as she called it, an archive, in which she recorded conversations she had overheard or engaged with women who were involved in 1970s feminism. The confessional passages in these photographs are based on these conversations and comically mimic the style of women's magazines. The panels themselves replicate the scale of bus stop advertisements and have reflective surfaces, meaning that standing in front of the photographs, the viewers see themselves reflected in the work. This creates a sense of perhaps uncomfortable complicity. But while the work Corpus is titled after the body, Mary Kelly never actually represents the female form. Instead, she tries to convey women's consciousness and subjectivity. She said, "I wanted to give voice to the woman, to represent her as the subject of the gaze." The next work I want to speak about also explores the representation of women through photography. This is the Nobel Prize-winning author Alice Walker, dressed as the ancient Greek muse of idyllic poetry in Maud Salter's brilliant series, Zabat. Maud Sulter was a Scottish Ghanaian artist, poet, and curator, among other things. She was an extraordinary polymath. She grew up in Glasgow and moved to London aged 17 to study at the London College of Fashion. In the 1980s, she became a key figure in the British Black Arts movement, which looked to feminist and anti-racist theory to comment on the politics of representation. She died tragically young at the age of only 47, but left behind an extraordinary body of work. She was an early supporter of the women's art collection and encouraged other artists in her network, including Lubaina Hamid and Claudia Clare, to donate artworks to it. Throughout her career, Maud Salter challenged the invisibility of Black women in the histories of art, photography, and the media. Her series Zabat, which this photograph is from, comprises 9 photographic portraits of Black female artists, writers, performers, and activists dressed as the Greek muses. Maud Salter described the series as a diasporan family portrait, and in it she subverts traditional representations of the muses in European art. Rather than their usual attributes, these muses hold objects which interweave the histories of Africa, America, and Europe. The muse of idyllic poetry is traditionally depicted as a young woman with a joyous air, crowned with ivy, wearing boots and holding a comic mask. In her guise as the muse, Alice Walker is instead dressed in a poncho with an African print and carries a bouquet of flowers. Her bouquet recalls the figure of Laure, the Black servant, in Edward Manet's famous painting Olympia from 1863. It also makes reference to Alice Walker's collection of writings, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. The poncho and rose-tinted sunglasses reflect the fashions of 1960s flower power, And the colours in the bouquet, red, yellow, and green, are the same as those in the Ghanaian flag, a reference to Maud Salter's heritage. The experts on Greek muses among you will also know that the muse of idyllic poetry is called Thalia with a TH rather than Thalia with a PH, as Maud Salter spells it in the title of this work. Thalia is in fact the name of a city in Pakistan. In her work, Maud Salter played a lot with language, reflecting the politics of the Black arts movement. So it's possible that Maud Salter is making a point here about the interconnectedness between disparate geographies and histories. Each of the portraits in Zabat is accompanied by a prose poem that resembles a stream of consciousness narrative recounting the stories of real or imagined women. Again, reflecting her experimentation with language, these poems incorporate vernacular dialects, archaic words, and deliberate misspellings. In the poem accompanying her portrait of Alice Walker, Maud Salter tells a parable-like story of a woman called the Bringer of Flowers, who wheels her cart around the place. The epigraph to another of the poems is a quote by Alice Walker in which she says, "As a Black person and a woman, I don't read history for facts, I read it for clues." And I would argue that this is the key for understanding Maud Salter's work as well. She plants clues and leaves it to the viewer to find and decipher them. Another work which provides clues with symbolic value is Rose Garrard's Madonna Cascade. Once described as the international enfant terrible of feminist performance art, Rose Garrard works in a range of mediums, from sculpture to audio art, creating works which engage with ideas around gender, status, and power. In 1982, when she was in her mid-30s, Rose Garrard went to an exhibition at Nottingham Castle called The Women's Art Show, which brought together works by women artists created between the 16th and 20th centuries. She later described how she had a feeling of literally being encircled and wrapped by women's paintbrush marks spanning over 500 years, and that this was the first feeling she had of a sense of place, of continuity, like a discovery of loss. She also described experiencing an anger and rage that for so many years there had been this absence that she couldn't even identify until now. This experience of seeing a lineage of women artists who were broadly absent from art history books and museum collections inspired Garrard to make her Madonna Models Triptych series. The triptych features recreations of self-portraits by 3 historic women artists, Artemisia Gentileschi, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and Judith Leyster, which is the one you can see here. To make the works, she created a central panel using plaster, then reinforced it with layers of a fabric called scrim, often used in theatre design. She then copied the self-portraits as frescoes, intending that the acrylic paint would be absorbed differently by the plaster and scrim and build up in uneven layers. So it has this very interesting texture. Each painting is framed on 3 sides by a plaster frame with casts of objects which carry certain symbolism in Garrard's childhood and relate to stereotypes about masculinity and femininity. In Madonna Cascade, the frame is cast from a figurine of the Virgin Mary that was placed by Garrard's bed by her Catholic mother. The work recreates a self-portrait by Judith Leyster, the Dutch Golden Age painter, created around 1630. It's likely that Leyster painted this self-portrait to present to the local guild so that she could apply to join it, which was very unusual for a woman at the time. She was, however, accepted into St. Luke's Guild of Haarlem and attained a large degree of recognition and success in her lifetime. But as soon as she died, aged 50, her entire oeuvre was attributed to her male contemporaries, including her husband and the artist Frans Hals. It was only centuries later, and slightly by accident, that her works were rightly attributed to her. Garrard spoke about how repainting these artists was a way of creating a closer relationship with them, of reclaiming them. This act of reclamation is informed by a spirit of celebration and a sense that women artists of the past should be rediscovered and supported for their achievements. However, Garrard isn't just interested in replacing a male-defined tradition with an equivalent female pantheon. Instead, she investigates and reflects on the reasons why these artists were lost to history, and her works are an act of feminist protest. Rose Garrard was among the first artists to donate to the Women's Art Collection in 1992, and her work was on display as part of the opening exhibition in September of that year. In a letter written on paper with a beautiful rose-themed letterhead, she informed the president of the college that the work requires me to install it on site, somewhere where it would not be tripped over. In its location in the college, where it is safe from even the clumsiest of passers-by at the bottom of a stairwell, the plaster sculpture seems almost to emerge from the white brick wall, embodying the very essence of this collection of women artists. And just as Rose Garrard felt in the exhibition at Nottingham Castle, I think that at Murray Edwards one had the sense of literally being encircled by women's art making. Marlene Rolfe is another artist whose relationship with the college goes back to its early days. An alumna of the college, in 1993, she wrote in saying, "I have read with great interest about the Women's Art Collection. It's a simple but brilliant idea, and of course the college is an ideal setting for such a focus, both architecturally and culturally." She offered to donate an artwork and eventually ended up giving 3, including this tender portrait of her mother at her kitchen table. After reading English at Cambridge, Marlene Rolfe worked as a teacher and landscape architect before becoming a painter. She also worked for a period in residential homes for elderly European Jewish refugees. Her mother Ilse herself was a German Jewish refugee in England. As a young woman in Berlin, Ilse was an active member of the Communist Party and the German resistance. She was arrested and spent 3 years in concentration camps, including the all-women's Ravensbrück. In 1939, she was released on condition that she leave Germany immediately. Ilse's mother, who had not been able to escape, was sent to Buchitz, the German extermination camp in Poland, and murdered there in 1942. Marlene Rolfe herself knew almost nothing of this family history until she was in her 40s. She even said she did not remember hearing the word Jewish before she was 10 years old. However, when her mother was dying, she increasingly wanted to recreate the lost world of her family's past and of her own childhood. She began researching her mother's life and background, going to Berlin, visiting the sites of her mother's imprisonment, and tracking the details of her grandmother's deportation. While in Berlin, she found some examples of women's resistance during that period in history, tiny subversive leaflets and fake covers, illicit embroideries and playthings made by the women in concentration camps. She later reflected, "How can I deal visually with questions of the small actions against the massive sweep of events, of personal, private histories and continuities, of female as opposed to male courage, of women's work and women's language?" Many of Marlene Rolfe's paintings are modest in scale, focusing on aspects of women's lives, often in juxtaposition with dehumanized, abstracted forms suggestive of the architecture of concentration camps. She uses color in an intense, non-naturalistic way, creating memorials to things glimpsed or half seen, things remembered or half forgotten, fragments of other places and other worlds. This quiet domestic scene depicts the artist's kitchen with her mother seated at the table. She seems to be inspecting her own clothing or perhaps saying hello to a pet under the table. The luminous colors convey the impression of dusk, mirroring her mother's old age and physical frailty. The large red mug, which stands center stage, further emphasizes the figure's small stature, and the understated title, "Mum with Red Cup," belies the painting's emotional charge, capturing this elderly woman's immense trauma and indomitable force of spirit. Here is its sister painting, Kitchen Table, which is also in the Women's Art Collection. Depicting the same corner of the artist's kitchen, the paintings have certain noticeable differences. While in Mum with Red Cup, the scene appeared to be illuminated by lamp, in Kitchen Table, it instead seems flooded in natural light. The human presence is replaced with 2 plugs in their sockets. banal features of everyday life, which under Marlene Rolfe's brush become something beautiful and haunting. The presence of death is also explicit in another piece in the collection, Paula Rego's Inez de Castro. Paula Rego, who sadly passed away in last year, was an honorary fellow of Murray Edwards, and in 2014 offered to create a work to mark the college's 60th anniversary. She set a group of academics at the college some homework to come up with a subject for her to paint. They came up with several suggestions: Christina Rossetti's narrative poem Goblin Market, or Scott Adele's children's book Island of the Blue Dolphins. At the end of the email, they added, "Failing this, we wondered about picking up a Portuguese story. A colleague tells me," the person writing, "that Ezra Pound makes reference to the story of Pedro and Inez. I wonder whether this is something you've already thought of." They didn't hear back for several weeks. When they finally did, Paula Rego's PA wrote to say that the painting of Inez and Pedro was finished and she'd created this brilliant work. Paula Rego was born and brought up in Portugal under the fascist dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. When she was 16, she moved to the UK and studied at the Slade in London. She often drew inspiration from Portuguese fables and folklore, and the themes of fear, cruelty, and violence feature prominently in her work. So the tale of Inez is well suited to her practice. The tale of Inez is one of Portugal's foundational myths. Inez was a 14th century Galician noblewoman who had an affair with Prince Pedro, for which she was brutally murdered by his father, the King Alfonso. According to the legend, when Pedro ascended to the throne, he exhumed Inez's corpse and gave his dead lover a lavish coronation, which is the scene that's depicted in this painting. The tale is about violence and nationalism, but also about enduring love, with echoes of Romeo and Juliet. In Rego's painting, the gold and red color palette and the character's courtly pose mimic the appearance of medieval illuminated manuscripts. She also used metallic paint, so when the light hits the painting, it sparkles. But unlike most manuscripts, the size of the work is monumental. Rego described her work as a subversion of hierarchies. She said, "I can turn the tables and make women stronger than men. I can make them obedient and murderous at the same time." In her interpretation of the tale of Inez, Rego foregrounds her female protagonist so that she dominates the composition, even in death. Like Mary Kelly's Extase, Inez de Castro hangs in the college dining room. A massive painting of a skeleton in a regal dress is an unusual accompaniment to one's lunch, but one which has inspired many a conversation. The final work that I want to talk about is Anya Paintsil's Blood, which was created last year for our exhibition, What Lies Beneath Women, Politics, Textiles, and was then accessioned into the permanent collection. It's one of the most recent acquisitions by the collection, and Anya's currently the youngest artist represented in it. Though still in her 20s, Anya has a distinctive, instantly recognizable style. She directly draws on her Welsh Ghanaian heritage to create her textile works by using a combination of the historic rug hooking techniques passed down by generations of Welsh women in her family and methods for styling black and Afro hair. Growing up in rural Wales, Anya's mother would have to take her to Manchester to get her hair done, about a 2-hour drive away. When she was around 9, she learned how to take her own braids out, make them look neat, and reuse them. At a certain point, she realized there was a lot of crossover between black hair techniques and the latch hook rug technique her grandmother had taught her, which was traditionally used by working class women who would collect cuts and yarns and fashion them into larger textiles. She said she found it really interesting how similar techniques and tools were used by very different communities for very different things. This work, Blodeuwedd, is part of Anya's series of portraits of women from Welsh folklore. Blodeuwedd, the central character in the tale of Math Fab Mathonwy, translates from Middle Welsh as a more poetic version of flower face, or sort of formed by flowers. This work, I think, has real resonance with Maud Sulter's depiction of Black women as the Greek muses, which counteract traditional depictions in European art history. The Welsh titles are based on Anya's sense of childhood nostalgia, as well as the way of protecting the Welsh language. You can't tell from the image, but her works in real life look incredibly soft and tactile. As of a couple of weeks ago, we have a beautiful acrylic box framing the work to protect it. But before that, people would sometimes ask whether they could touch it. It's precisely this desire that Anya challenges in her work. When she was growing up, people would often touch her hair without her permission, and she now integrates her hair into many of her works. Similarly, people have the urge to touch textiles because they're so often part of the domestic environment. But by using these materials in her artwork, Anya is signaling that they must be respected and not touched. She's asking her viewers to reconsider what art can be. And I love that effect of simultaneously being seduced and rebuffed by this artwork. And on that note, I will end this talk. Thank you so much again for joining me for this whistle-stop tour of the Women's Art Collection, and to Art UK for organising it.